The town of Maple Grove had always admired the charismatic preacher Michael Carter and his seemingly idyllic family. Michael, a devout and articulate preacher, had earned the community's respect for his impassioned sermons on faith and morality. His wife, Grace, was a gentle and warm-hearted woman, beloved by the congregation for her kindness and unwavering support of her husband's ministry. Together, they raised 4 children, each one a testament, it seemed, to the blessings of their union. Their eldest, Clara, was a bright and responsible teenager, often seen helping her mother with church events. Then came the twins, Emma and Ethan, who brought laughter and mischief to the Carter household. The youngest, Noah, a sweet 6-year-old, was the darling of the congregation, always clutching a small Bible as he toddled behind his father on Sundays. To the outside world, the Carters epitomized a family blessed by God's grace. The Carter home was as warm and inviting as its inhabitants. Grace had adorned the walls with scriptures and family portraits, while Michael kept his study filled with theological books and sermon notes. Their home hosted Bible studies, youth gatherings, and countless Sunday dinners. For years, their life seemed to radiate harmony and divine favor. But within the walls of their seemingly perfect home lay unspoken tensions. Michael was a man of strong convictions, and his faith often translated into rigid expectations for his family. Grace, though devoted, carried silent burdens that she never shared with anyone, not even her closest friends. Despite their public display of unity, fissures were beginning to form beneath the surface. One Sunday evening, as the family gathered around the dinner table, Grace's smile faltered for a moment as she watched Michael lead the children in prayer. It was a fleeting moment, unnoticed by anyone but Clara, who had grown more observant of her mother's demeanor in recent months. Grace seemed tired, worn down by something that no one could name. Michael, on the other hand, appeared as steadfast as ever. His booming voice filled the room as he blessed the meal, his confidence in his faith unshaken. Yet, in his study, late at night, Michael often found himself grappling with doubts he dared not admit. The pressures of leading a congregation and maintaining the image of a perfect family weighed heavily on him. Life carried on as usual in the Carter household until one fateful day when Michael stumbled upon a folder that would change everything. It was an unassuming, dusty file tucked away in a forgotten corner of the attic. Inside, he found medical records that had belonged to Grace, records he had never seen before. As he skimmed the documents, his heart began to race. The words leaped off the page: fertility test results, 2008. Michael read them once, then twice, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. The results indicated that Grace had been diagnosed with infertility years before they had even met. A wave of confusion and anger swept over him. If Grace had been barren, then how could they have 4 children? The answer seemed obvious to him, though he refused to entertain the thought for too long. His mind, already strained by the pressures of his life, spiraled into a storm of suspicion and betrayal. The discovery marked the beginning of a dark chapter for the Carter family. Michael, who had always prided himself on being a man of God, found his faith tested in ways he had never imagined. The seed of doubt that had been planted in his heart grew rapidly, tainting his perception of Grace and their children. The man who had once preached forgiveness and unconditional love now found himself consumed by anger and resentment. Grace, unaware of her husband's discovery, continued her daily routine, oblivious to the storm brewing within Michael. She noticed that he had become more distant, his warm smiles replaced by cold stares, but she attributed it to the stress of his ministry. Little did she know that the man she had loved and supported for years was now harboring thoughts that would shatter their world. As the days turned into weeks, Michael's behavior became increasingly erratic. He would stare at the children with an intensity that made Clara uncomfortable, and his once loving gestures toward Grace were replaced by curt words and dismissive glances. The change in her husband frightened Grace, but she couldn't bring herself to confront him. Instead, she prayed for him, hoping that whatever was troubling him would pass. Unknown to Grace, Michael was spiraling deeper into darkness. The discovery of the fertility test results had ignited a fire within him, a fire fueled by jealousy, betrayal, and a twisted sense of righteousness. He convinced himself that Grace had deceived him, that the life they had built together was a lie. And in his mind, there was only one way to cleanse himself of the pain and betrayal he felt. Michael could not let go of the folder he found in the attic. Night after night, he sat in his study, staring at the papers that had shaken the foundation of his life. The words infertility and barren haunted him, and the thought of Grace lying to him all these years consumed his mind. How could she have hidden such a thing from him? How could the children he had raised and loved not be his own? His mind refused to rest. He replayed moments from their marriage, questioning everything: her smiles, her reassurances, even the births of their children. To him, each memory now seemed tainted by lies. He thought about Clara, Emma, Ethan, and Noah, the children he had preached about in his sermons as gifts from God. Were they gifts, or were they proof of betrayal? Grace remained unaware of the storm raging inside Michael. She noticed his distance, but whenever she asked him what was wrong, he brushed her off with a stiff, "I'm fine." Yet his behavior was changing. He no longer joined the children for bedtime prayers. He no longer reached out to hold her hand in church. He no longer smiled at her. Then one evening, Michael made up his mind. He convinced himself that Grace's supposed deception was not just a personal betrayal, but a sin against God. In his twisted reasoning, he saw himself as the victim, and he believed Grace needed to be punished. His heart, once full of love for his wife, now burned with anger and hatred. The next morning, Michael suggested something unexpected. "Let's go on a trip," he told Grace over breakfast, forcing a smile. The children were busy eating, unaware of the tension between their parents. "Just the two of us. You've been working so hard, and I think we need some time alone." Grace looked up, surprised. Michael hadn't spoken kindly to her in weeks. The offer felt like a glimmer of hope. "A trip?" she asked, her voice hesitant but hopeful. "Where would we go?" "Somewhere quiet. Somewhere far from everything," Michael said, his tone unusually gentle. "I'll make the arrangements. You don't need to worry about a thing." Grace smiled softly, thinking that perhaps this was Michael's way of healing whatever had been troubling him. She agreed, feeling a spark of optimism. Clara, overhearing the conversation, teased her parents, "Don't forget to bring us back souvenirs." Michael chuckled, masking the darkness in his heart. "Of course, Clara," he said, ruffling her hair. But inside, he wasn't thinking about souvenirs or vacations. He was already planning how the trip would end. A few days later, Michael and Grace packed their bags. The children waved goodbye from the porch, excited for their parents to have some time alone. Michael reassured them, "We'll be back before you know it." He drove them out of town, far away from Maple Grove. Grace watched the landscape change from familiar streets to empty fields, her excitement slowly giving way to unease. "Where are we going, Michael?" she asked after a while. "You'll see," he replied, his voice calm but distant. By the time they reached an old, abandoned farmhouse on a deserted road, Grace's unease had turned into fear. "Why are we stopping here?" she asked, her voice trembling. Michael didn't answer. Instead, he got out of the car and walked around to her side, opening the door. "Get out," he said, his tone cold. Grace hesitated. "Michael, what's going on?" "Get out," he repeated, his eyes blazing with anger. She stepped out of the car, her hands shaking. Michael grabbed a can of gasoline from the trunk, and that's when Grace realized the danger she was in. "Michael, please," she begged, her voice breaking. "Whatever this is, we can talk about it." But Michael didn't listen. He doused the farmhouse with gasoline and forced Grace inside. Her screams echoed through the empty fields as he struck a match and threw it into the building. Flames erupted, swallowing the farmhouse and everything inside. Michael stood there, watching the fire consume the woman he once loved. His face was emotionless, his heart hardened by the lies he believed. He stayed until the fire began to die down, then got back into his car and drove away, leaving the charred remains of a farmhouse behind. Unknown to him, someone had seen everything. A farmer working in a nearby field had noticed the smoke and come closer to investigate. Horrified by what he witnessed, the farmer called the police, reporting the crime in detail. Michael had planned to return to Maple Grove, as if nothing had happened, but the farmer's report set a chain of events in motion that would bring him to justice. As the farmhouse burned into the night, Michael drove away, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. The flames danced in his rearview mirror, but he didn't look back. His mind buzzed with chaotic thoughts, a mixture of rage, relief, and denial. He told himself it had to be done, that Grace's betrayal had left him no choice. He believed he was carrying out God's will, but deep inside, a small voice whispered doubt, a voice he ruthlessly silenced. Meanwhile, less than a mile away, a local farmer named Hank was tending to his land. He'd been working late, repairing the fencing on his property, when the acrid smell of smoke caught his attention. At first, he thought it might be a controlled burn, something farmers occasionally did to clear fields. But the thick, dark column of smoke rising into the night sky seemed wrong. His curiosity got the better of him, and he decided to investigate. As Hank got closer, the flickering glow of flames came into view. He hurried toward the scene, his heart pounding. From behind the cover of trees, he saw the farmhouse engulfed in fire, and, just beyond it, a man standing motionless. It took Hank only a moment to realize this wasn't an accident, it was deliberate. He froze, his breath catching in his throat as he recognized the man, Preacher Michael Carter. Hank's mind raced. Michael wasn't just anyone. He was a respected leader in Maple Grove. To think that the preacher could be involved in something so horrifying was unthinkable. Yet, the evidence was right in front of him. Hank watched as Michael tossed the match into the flames and calmly walked back to his car. The scene felt surreal, like something out of a nightmare. As Michael drove away, Hank stayed hidden, waiting until he was sure the man was gone. Then, with trembling hands, he reached for his phone and called the police. "There's been a fire," he said, his voice shaking. "And think someone was inside. You need to get out here now." The dispatcher asked for details, and Hank did his best to explain what he had seen. He described Michael's car as clothing and the direction he had driven. "He's the preacher," Hank added reluctantly, knowing how shocking this would sound. "Michael Carter. You've got to stop him before he gets away." By the time Michael returned to Maple Grove, the police were already mobilizing. Hank's detailed report had set off a manhunt, and officers were now searching for Michael's car. Oblivious to the unfolding investigation, Michael parked in his driveway and entered the house, where his children were waiting. "Daddy, you're back," little Noah exclaimed, running to hug him. Michael knelt to embrace his son, his hands still smelling faintly of gasoline. For a moment, the weight of what he had done hit him, like a wave. But he quickly pushed the feeling aside, reminding himself that everything he had done was for the sake of righteousness. Clara, ever perceptive, noticed her father's odd behavior. "Where's Mom?" she asked, her voice cautious. Michael hesitated, his mind scrambling for an answer. She decided to stay with a friend for a few days," he lied, forcing a smile. "She needed a little break. Don't worry, she'll be back soon." Clara's eyes narrowed slightly, but she said nothing. Something about her father's demeanor fell off, but she didn't press him further. As the night wore on, Michael began to sense the net closing in around him. He thought about Hank, the farmer who might have seen him at the scene, and paranoia began to creep in. The town was small, and news traveled fast. It wouldn't be long before someone connected the dots. The next morning, the police arrived at the Carter home. Michael saw the patrol cars pull into the driveway and knew his time was up. For a brief moment he considered surrendering, but the thought of facing judgment for what he had done filled him with panic. Instead, he decided to run. "Kids, stay inside," he said hurriedly, grabbing his coat. Clara, now openly suspicious, watched as her father slipped out the back door. She ran to the window and saw him climbing into his car. "Daddy, where are you going?" she shouted, but he didn't answer. Michael sped down the road, his mind racing. He knew the back roads well and hoped to evade the authorities long enough to cross state lines. But the police were one step ahead. Hank's report had included detailed information about Michael's vehicle, and roadblocks had been set up along the major routes out of town. It didn't take long for the officers to spot Michael's car. A high-speed chase ensued, with Michael weaving recklessly through traffic in a desperate bid to escape. His calm, controlled demeanor had completely unraveled, replaced by fear and desperation. The chase ended abruptly when Michael lost control of his car on a sharp turn. The vehicle skidded off the road and into a ditch, coming to a jarring stop. Within moments, police surrounded the car, guns drawn. "Step out of the vehicle with your hands up," an officer shouted. Michael hesitated, his hands trembling on the steering wheel. For a brief moment, he considered making one final stand, but the realization that it was over finally sank in. Slowly, he opened the door and stepped out, his hands raised in surrender. As the officers placed him in handcuffs, Michael's mind was a whirlwind of emotions. He thought about Grace, about the fire, about the life he had destroyed. For the first time, the gravity of his actions began to sink in, but it was too late for regret. Michael Carter was taken into police custody that same night. News of his arrest spread through Maple Grove like wildfire. By morning, the once beloved preacher was the center of the town's most shocking scandal. People gathered in small groups, whispering in disbelief. Could the man who had baptized their children, officiated their weddings, and comforted them in times of grief really have done something so horrifying? The children, however, remained in the dark. Clara, Emma, Ethan, and Noah had been taken in by a kind neighbor who offered to watch them while the police investigated. Clara, now more suspicious than ever, pressed the neighbor for answers, but no one wanted to be the one to tell a 16-year-old that her father had been arrested for murder. Meanwhile, at the station, Michael sat in an interrogation room, staring at the table in front of him. The room was cold and stark, and the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above his head. He didn't speak, didn't ask for a lawyer. The only words he muttered were prayers, whispered under his breath, as if he still believed God would forgive him for what he had done. Detective Karen Mills, a seasoned investigator, sat across from Michael. Her calm demeanor belied the outrage she felt over the crime. "Michael," she began, her voice steady but firm, "we've spoken to a witness. We know you were at the farmhouse. We know what happened to Grace. It's time to tell the truth." Michael didn't respond at first. His jaw tightened, and he avoided her gaze. Finally, he muttered, "She lied to me. She betrayed me." "Betrayed you?" Karen repeated, leaning forward. "How did she betray you, Michael? What could she have possibly done to deserve what you did to her?" Michael's eyes flashed with anger, but also with something else, pain. "She wasn't who she said she was," he said, his voice rising. "She lied about everything. About the kids. About being a wife. She made a fool of me." Karen frowned, piecing together his disjointed confession. "The kids? What are you talking about? Are you saying you thought Grace was unfaithful?" Michael hesitated, then nodded. "She couldn't have had children," he said bitterly. "I found the proof. An old test. She was barren. And yet, we had 4 children together. 4. How is that possible unless she—" Karen interrupted, her voice sharp. "Unless she what, Michael? Cheated on you? Is that what you're saying?" "Yes," Michael shouted, slamming his hands on the table. "She deceived me. She made me believe they were mine, that we were a family. But it was all a lie." Karen's expression softened, but only slightly. She had dealt with many cases over the years, and while she'd seen people commit horrific acts for petty reasons, Michael's delusion struck her as particularly tragic. She reached into the folder in front of her and pulled out a document. "Michael," she said quietly, "this is the same fertility test you're talking about. We've reviewed it. Do you know what it says?" Michael didn't respond, his anger still simmering. Karen continued, "It says Grace had difficulty conceiving. It doesn't say she was barren. There's a difference. Did she ever tell you about this?" Michael blinked, his fury momentarily replaced by confusion. She didn't tell me anything, he muttered. She hid it from me. Did you ever ask her? Karen pressed. Did you ever consider that maybe she didn't lie to you? That maybe those kids were yours all along? Michael's silence was deafening. The certainty he had clung to began to crumble. But it was too late. The truth, if it even mattered anymore, could not undo what he had done. Back at the Carter home, Clara, the eldest child, was beginning to piece things together. The neighbor had left the TV on, and though she tried to shield the kids from the news, Clara caught a glimpse of the headline, "Local preacher arrested for wife's murder." Her heart dropped. She rushed to the phone and called the police station, demanding to know what was going on. When she got no answers, she turned to the neighbor. "What happened to my mom?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Where is she?" The neighbor hesitated, then knelt down to Clara's level. "Sweetheart, your mom's not coming back," she said gently. "And your dad, he's in a lot of trouble." Clara's face crumpled, and tears streamed down her cheeks. She clutched her younger siblings, who didn't fully understand what was happening, but cried anyway because Clara was crying. The once happy Carter household had been shattered, and nothing would ever be the same. The community's reaction was swift and unforgiving. Parishioners who had once idolized Michael were now burning with anger and betrayal. He was supposed to be a man of God, one churchgoer said during an impromptu prayer circle held outside the church. How could he do something so evil? Others expressed sadness for the Carter children. "Those poor kids," another parishioner murmured. "What are they going to do without their parents? How do you even recover from something like this?" The town's shock turned to outrage as more details of the case emerged. The media descended on Maple Grove, turning the quiet community into a spectacle. Reporters camped outside the police station, the courthouse, and even the Carter home, hoping for a glimpse of the children or a comment from the neighbors. Through it all, Michael remained stoic. He refused to speak further to the police, his silence a wall that no one could penetrate. But the evidence was overwhelming, and the case against him was airtight. Grace's murder had been brutal, senseless, and premeditated, and the community demanded justice. The trial of Michael Carter began 3 months after his arrest. By then, the once respected preacher was unrecognizable to the people of Maple Grove. Gone was the confident, charismatic man who had led their church with passion. In his place sat a gaunt, hollow-eyed figure, his hands shackled as he was escorted into the courtroom. The townspeople packed the gallery, desperate to see justice served. The prosecution wasted no time painting a damning picture of Michael. They presented the fertility test as evidence, explaining how Michael had twisted its findings into a motive for murder. Witnesses were called to testify, including Hank, the farmer who had seen the crime unfold. Hank recounted the horror of that night, his voice trembling as he described the flames and Michael's cold demeanor as he left the scene. "I couldn't believe what I was seeing," Hank told the court. "He just walked away, like it didn't even matter." The prosecution also highlighted Michael's actions leading up to the murder, including his sudden suggestion of a vacation and the way he isolated Grace from her children. They painted him as a man consumed by paranoia and rage, willing to destroy his family to feed his delusions. But the most heartbreaking testimony came from Clara. The court had initially hesitated to involve the children, but Clara insisted on speaking. At 16, she was old enough to understand the gravity of what had happened and brave enough to face her father in court. Standing at the witness stand, Clara's voice wavered as she described the days leading up to her mother's death. "I knew something was wrong," she said, her hands clenched tightly together. "Dad wasn't himself. He stopped talking to us, stopped smiling. And when Mom didn't come back, I just knew." Michael avoided Clara's gaze as she spoke, but she didn't look away. Tears filled her eyes as she addressed the courtroom. "My mom didn't deserve this. She loved him. She loved all of us. And now she's gone because he couldn't see that." The defense had little to work with. They argued that Michael had acted out of a moment of insanity, driven by a mental breakdown rather than premeditation. They called a psychologist to testify about Michael's deteriorating mental state, but it did little to sway the jury. The evidence was too damning, and the crime too heinous. The trial lasted 3 weeks, but the jury needed only a few hours to deliberate. When they returned with their verdict, the courtroom fell silent. The foreman stood and announced, "We, the jury, find the defendant, Michael Carter, guilty of first-degree murder." Gasps filled the room, followed by murmurs of approval. The judge then delivered the sentence: death by lethal injection. Michael showed no emotion as the sentence was read. He simply stared ahead, his face devoid of the fire and passion that had once defined him. As he was escorted out of the courtroom, a member of his former congregation called out, "You betrayed all of us." Others joined in, shouting accusations and curses, their voices echoing through the halls. For a man who had once been revered as a moral and spiritual leader, the fall from grace was complete. While justice was served, the aftermath of the trial left the Carter children in a state of emotional devastation. Clara, now the de facto head of the household, struggled to provide a sense of normalcy for her siblings. Emma and Ethan, at just 11 years old, were old enough to understand that their lives would never be the same. Noah, the youngest, kept asking when Mommy and Daddy would come home, not fully grasping the permanence of their absence. The community, though initially sympathetic, began to distance itself from the children. People who had once embraced them now avoided their gaze, as if the stain of Michael's crime extended to his innocent offspring. Clara found herself increasingly isolated, forced to navigate the harsh realities of adulthood far sooner than she should have. Still, there were a few who reached out to help. The neighbor who had taken them in continued to provide support, as did a handful of church members who saw the children as victims rather than extensions of their father. But the damage was done, and the Carter children were left to rebuild their lives with little more than each other. Michael spent the months following his sentencing in a state of quiet resignation. He rarely spoke, even to his lawyer or the prison chaplain. The man who had once preached about forgiveness and redemption now seemed incapable of seeking either. He spent his days in his cell, staring at the walls, his mind replaying the events that had led him there. On the day of his execution, a small crowd gathered outside the prison. Some held signs demanding justice, while others prayed for Michael's soul. Inside, he was offered the chance to make a final statement. He declined, his silence continuing to the very end. As the lethal injection was administered, Michael's final thoughts were of Grace. For the first time since her death, he allowed himself to feel the weight of what he had done. But the realization came too late, and within minutes, the man who had once stood in the pulpit as a symbol of morality was gone. With Michael's execution, the Carter family saga officially came to an end, but the scars he left behind lingered in the hearts of his children and the Maple Grove community. Clara, Emma, Ethan, and Noah were placed in the care of their aunt, a distant relative who lived in another state. The transition was anything but easy. Clara, the eldest, took on a parental role for her siblings, ensuring they had some stability despite the chaos. She enrolled in therapy, determined to work through her grief and anger. Emma and Ethan withdrew into themselves, often clinging to each other for comfort. Noah, the youngest, struggled the most to comprehend what had happened. For years, he believed his mother had simply gone on a long trip, and his father had been taken away by mistake. The family home in Maple Grove was eventually sold, its once warm and inviting atmosphere now a haunting reminder of the life they had lost. The children rarely spoke of their parents, but on the anniversaries of Grace's death, they would light a candle in her memory. Clara would sometimes share stories about their mother, careful to leave out the darker truths of their father's actions. For her siblings, Grace remained a symbol of love and kindness, untouched by the tragedy that had unfolded. The town of Maple Grove also struggled to heal. The church that Michael had once led was closed for several months. Its doors shuttered as the congregation grappled with the betrayal of their preacher. When it finally reopened under new leadership, attendance was sparse. Many of the parishioners had lost their faith, not in God, but in the institution they had once trusted. Hank, the farmer who had reported the crime, became something of a local hero. Though he carried the weight of what he had witnessed, he found solace in knowing that he had done the right thing. "If I hadn't made that call," he often said, "who knows what else he might have done." For the townspeople, the story of Michael Carter served as a grim reminder of the darkness that can hide behind even the most righteous facade. It sparked conversations about mental health, forgiveness, and the importance of addressing issues before they fester into tragedy. Slowly, the community began to move forward, though the memory of what had happened remained an indelible mark on Maple Grove's history. Years later, Clara, now an adult, decided to share her family's story in a memoir. In the book, she recounted the pain, confusion, and loss she and her siblings had endured, but also their journey toward healing. "My father's actions do not define us," she wrote. "We are more than the tragedy that tore our family apart. We are survivors." Clara's memoir became a bestseller, inspiring readers with its message of resilience and hope. It also brought attention to the importance of addressing domestic issues and the dangers of unchecked anger and resentment. Proceeds from the book were used to fund scholarships for children who had lost parents to violence, ensuring that Grace's memory lived on in a meaningful way. As you reflect on this story, consider the impact it had on the lives involved and the lessons it offers about love, forgiveness, and the dangers of letting anger consume us. If you found this story thought-provoking and want to explore more gripping tales of resilience and human complexity, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Hit the like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and ring the notification bell so you never miss an update. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for more stories that matter.